Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining this webinar. We're going to look at assessment in the light of the Donaldson review, and we're then going to move on and hopefully demonstrate to you how our new combination report can support assessment of children in Wales. We will have some time at the end of this webinar for questions. I'd like to start by introducing you to Phil Marvin, who is our Head of Training. He's here with me this afternoon.
Hello, and I'll be looking at the combination report predominantly.
And my name is Sue Thompson, and I'm the Senior Publisher at GL Assessment. So, as you may already know, Professor Donaldson's review, which was entitled Successful Futures, was published in February this year. And amongst the 68 recommendations, there were several about assessment and also about capacity and teacher assessment. In June of this year, the Welsh Government accepted all of the recommendations, and an implementation plan was launched in October this year. So the plan is to be rolled out over several years, but the first implementation is to be by 2018, with full implementation by 2021. Another very, very important document is entitled Qualified for Life, and we've pulled out here something that we think is particularly important from our point of view, but also from the point of view of schools. And just to balance this statement from Qualified for Life, I'd like to share with you our whole pupil approach, and this is an approach that we have worked up over several years here at GL Assessment, and we have developed assessments in ability attainment and a particular survey that looks at potential barriers for learning. And with teacher judgment, this creates this whole pupil approach. So we're going to explore this in more detail when we get to the section on the combination report. So there are various ways where we think we can help with implementing the Donaldson review. And you've been invited to attend this webinar this afternoon because you are either using in your school CAT 4 or the pupil attitudes to self and school, the PATH survey. And we feel that these are fantastic foundations for expanding and enhancing the assessment regimes that are already in school. So these are some of the things that Donaldson was focusing on, looking at skills and attributes. Clearly with CAT and with PATH we're looking at attributes, and we'll talk about our new progress test series, which will look at children's skills in core subjects. Learning should be viewed as a continuum, and we would also say that assessment should be viewed as a continuum, and we can facilitate this. Assessment should be in the form of readily understandable assessment reports, and those of you using CAT will know that we have developed a range of reports, many of them with narrative that suggest implications for teaching and learning. So we've tried to do that, working with teachers and other professionals to produce reports that really can support teachers and their students in raising attainment. A range of assessment approaches should be used. So the main approach from GL Assessment is using standardized tests, and the emphasis should be on formative assessment. CAT and PATH are formative assessments, and our progress test series may be used formatively or summatively. So we feel that there are very important areas within the review where we can play a role. Another area where we can support is the area of teacher assessment, and you will know that very recently teacher assessment has been criticised, particularly by ESTIN, and Professor Donaldson has picked this up, and his review wants to address current weaknesses and ensure that the assessment arrangements support the purposes of education. So he talks a lot in his review about capacity and building that capacity within the teaching workforce to be able to improve teacher assessment. And this is another aspect of the assessments that we produce. They can support teachers in moderating their teacher assessment. So we're just working our way through some of the more pertinent areas of the Donaldson review. So we're absolutely in harmony here with these statements that are pulled from the review, that what matters must be assessed. The reason for assessing must be clear, and I would say that needs to be clear to the teaching staff and also to the student and possibly even the parent, so that the assessment purpose is absolutely clear, that a range of techniques should be used and the focus should be on progress. And again, we will demonstrate how our new progress test series allows you to track progress year on year across the primary and the secondary phases. That the evidence from any assessment should be used to inform self-evaluation, and we have several case studies on our website which offer good practice in terms of tracking, holding that data, analysing that data, and often building a database over a considerable amount of time that will show trends within the school, not just within particular cohorts but across cohorts and across time. Teacher capacity we've already alluded to, and also the idea that a coherent framework for each school should be put in place, and we would argue that our standardised assessments, particularly where CAT or PASS or the two together are being used, that we have a good contribution to make to that particular framework. So there are 6 areas of learning, and we have pulled out 4 of those just as examples of where we can support in terms of assessment. So in terms of health and well-being, the pupil attitudes to self and school, our PASS survey, is very widely used in Wales and successfully too, and it's a pastoral tool, and it can help, particularly in combination with CAT 4, to identify any barriers to learning. What are the issues that may be stopping a child achieving their potential? In languages, literacy and communication, we have several assessments, many of which are brand new. So our baseline, that's been used in some schools in Wales, that's an assessment for children entering school. Welcome, which is a really nice toolkit, again very widely used, and it screens for language and communication problems with children from, I think, age 2 to 6. And then our new progress test in English, which came out in March, and our new group reading test as well. Mathematics, again, new for this year, progress test in maths. And for science and technology, published in September, so absolutely brand new, our progress test in science. And all of these are underpinned by the information, by the data you get from the cognitive abilities test. Again, very widely used in Wales. So the Donaldson Review talks about progression steps, and these will come in place of levels. And this idea of doing away with these sort of universal expectations fits very nicely with our whole pupil view and with the benchmark that we use within our standardised assessment, and that is the standard age score, and we'll be looking at that later. So we feel that very much, although levels have been a feature of many of our reports, that as time moves on we will be replacing those with whatever emerges in terms of progression steps. PASS and in particular CAT 4 we feel are very, very good starting points. So you're going to know from CAT 4 the potential of that child. From past, you will know if there are any barriers to learning, and that's your starting point. And then you can add in test data, teacher assessment, whatever is available to you to look at those progression steps. So just very quickly, for those of you who are using PATH but not CAT, it's an ability test in 4 parts: verbal, quantitative, non-verbal and spatial ability. It can be used from year 2 to year 11. And very importantly, it produces a student profile of what we call learning preference. And this is where we look at the verbal score and the spatial score, and we make a comparison. And we have a graphical illustration that will show whether a student is on the verbal side or on the spatial side, and how far on those two opposing sides they are. And from that, we create the indications for teaching and learning. And from the mean score, which is the average score of all 4, we produce the indicators for example, GCSE. PATH is a survey, it's not a test. It has a very wide age range, and it's very easy and colour-coded in terms of interpretation, and importantly it does offer interventions as well. There's a toolkit that comes with it. So for those of you who are not familiar with our progress test series, we have, as we said, English, Maths and Science, and importantly you can use any of these tests formatively. So if you want to test early in the school year, it's possible to do that, or as many schools do, you test in the summer term, and that's a summative test. And there the data can be passed to the receiving teacher for the following school year, and that works extremely well. We offer a measure of progress year on year, and as we said, the national benchmark, which is the standard age score, and that is a UK standard. New as part of all 3 test series is the transition test, and that is a test which has been standardised for use in the first 6 weeks of year 7, so a very, very specific use. And importantly, this gives you a benchmark on entry to secondary. Many secondaries are using CAT 4. It gives you attainment against ability, and it takes account of the summer dip, which we know can impact on children's performance. A range of indicators are available as well. So let's just move on. So this is just another statement that we've pulled out from the Donaldson report, and we feel that this really does make the case for standardised assessments, supporting this aim, supporting and moderating teacher assessment. And because we have reports, for example, for CAT 4, we have a parent report and a pupil report. Our progress test series have a parent report. This allows the data that's contained in these reports to be disseminated to a wider audience. I'm going to hand over now to Phil, and he's going to talk through the combination report, and this is very much demonstrating how supplementing, widening your school's assessment regime can actually give you a whole new level of data to use with your students.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Sue. Yes, if I just turn initially to the theme that Sue introduced right at the start, and that is the model that we've been looking at GL assessment, it also very much focuses on the individual, and it places what we can bring to the table of assessment, if you like, around that. And the key areas for that are attainment, ability, and identifying barriers of learning. But I also want to look at how they come together to do that. And just before I do, I just reiterate the point, standardized scores Having a standard scale between different assessments allows us to meaningfully compare different assessments and different students, their performance in different areas, and for the same student in different parts of their learning. So if I just return to that diagram of the model of assessment we've been talking about. So the child there is at the centre. What we bring is around the side of that, but the whole thing is placed within teacher judgment. I think it's very important to remember that what we're good at is bringing that national benchmark, bringing that comparison to national samples. And what schools are best at are knowing the individual student, but working together, it can be much more enriched. A teacher judgment, yes, is absolutely vital for looking at gaps and looking at next stages, but it's also very, very hard using that method alone to see how that wider picture might impact. So I think this goes very much back to using different assessments for different purposes, but to keep in mind the one aim, and that is to move children forward. Why does it matter that they have a common scale? Well, because we can look at those different areas. We can look at attainment, what children, I like to think of this as what children can do, what they know now, what they're able to do. Whereas the ability area is looking at perhaps what is possible, what could be. And I think there it starts to make a lot more sense that if we compare what could be, as it were, outside of curriculum, and we look at what is happening within curriculum, any disparity, any difference between the two is going to very clearly highlight where there possibly are barriers to an individual realising that potential. So I don't see potential as a limiting factor. I see it more as an indicator, a benchmark of what at least should be achieved. And then everything else on top of that is where we can add value. So in terms of these combination reports, what we've done is we've started to put together data from attainment areas, such as progress test, maths and English and science to follow, alongside the cognitive abilities test. It's the CAT test that is the anchor that we make these comparisons, these judgments in differences, because it's the CAT test that is looking at things that could be if there were no barriers, and if children had a common curriculum and were bringing everything similarly to the assessment. And one way that we've talked about mostly in the past is looking at where the CAT test might suggest from its standardized scores that a certain level, an average level of attainment or performance might be expected, and then to look at what is happening and where what is happening is less than might be expected. That's a very clear indicator, this discrepancy, of underachievement, and we should start to look to see what might be causing that underachievement. As we look at the combination reports a bit later, you'll also see that we've actually taken that further to examine cases where individuals' current performance appears to outstrip an average level of performance expected from an ability score. And it is in the comparison of data that we feel the power of assessments comes to the fore. Any single assessment is exactly that, but used in combination, there's a lot more to be gained. Well, let's start by looking at some of the report formats. This is a report format for the combination report looking at maths attainment, progress test maths attainment, alongside score from the CAT. What we've decided to put together is the quantitative score from the CAT alongside the progress test maths. We use the verbal reasoning score from the cognitive abilities test alongside the new group reading test, and to also use that verbal reasoning score from the CAT alongside progress test English. Those are the pairs that we'll be using. In this first example, we're looking at maths attainment. And this is duplicated for different groups. Here the ones that are shown are where individual students are getting lower than expected maths attainment, again reference back to their CAT ability score, and much lower than expected maths attainment. Where that attainment is higher or much higher is also shown in the report, but this is just an example. What I would like to say about this is, if you are familiar with the CAT's individual report, we go into quite a bit of detail for the individual about specific things that might be looked at in terms of interpreting a profile within CAT and how that might impact on their learning. We've tried to do a similar kind of narrative for these groups of students, but it's actually impossible for us to use a national model to give specific areas to look at. So instead, what we're doing is we're highlighting a number of very, very important areas that we feel that we can offer suggestions or perhaps start the conversation, as it were, to look at areas that will have, well, certainly we know from research, will have a real impact on a child's attainment in day-to-day performance as opposed to their ability level. You may not be able to see that very clearly, so on the next couple of slides I've blown that up slightly larger. And you might say, well, why are we talking about acquiring English? Well, maths, perhaps in the olden days, would be just very much 7 times 32. It would be very numerical. These days, it's much more packed within literacy. If Jenny goes out and buys 7 pencils at 23 pence each and pays for the £5 note, how much change does she get? The maths is still there and is still at an appropriate level, but now there's a certain amount of literacy that has to be unpacked to get to the maths. So certainly English does impact on that. And I know Sue's going to have a little look at some exemplars later on, and I'm sure that might come forward. In this slide here, this is another form of the reporting where we have the students' names down the side. This is for the entire group. And in this case, again, we're looking at progress test math scores coupled with the CAT quantitative standardized age score. And we're working from the CAT score. So in the column that's marked discrepancy, we're talking about what might be expected from their CAT score. So if I was to just choose the top one there, Tom Albright, we can see that there is quite a difference between those two scores. And in fact, the discrepancy is highlighted as current attainment is much higher than expected. You can also see that we include the other scores from the CAT test so that that they're all in the same place. It's not a matter of trying to find different reports, but also, again, in the exemplars, you will see that their scores in other aspects highlighted by CAT will impact on these expectations. And Sue, do you want to say a little bit about
Yes,
Ben?
we've pulled out Ben Lynch, and we've, as Phil has been explaining, there is, even in a test where the reading load has been minimised, the way that maths is taught and examined does require children to have a good level of literacy and a good level of comprehension. So we've just queried there whether reading load could be an issue because his score for PTM is lower than expected. Now his quantitative score is 103, and that's absolutely spot on average, but that's looking at reasoning with number. If we look along at his spatial score, we can see that that is in the low average range at 86, and that is likely to have an impact on his mathematics attainment. If we look at his mean score, which is 92, we often use the mean score as an indicator, for example, of the level of attainment at GCSE, and this is at 92 is much more in line with his maths score. So it is, as Phil says, it's important to look at those other scores to see what the impact of those may well be on the attainment score.
I think we've got another couple of examples on the next slide, Sue.
Yes, so Danielle has a non-verbal reasoning score of 112 and a spatial ability score of 125. Now, her progress test in maths score was 91, so her attainment is much lower than expected, and that really does need further investigation.
Yeah, I think
again,
the verbal score was quite low.
The verbal was, I don't have
92,
I think it was 92. So again, it may be that it's a literacy issue here. Yes, at 92. That's quite out of line with her other scores. Her verbal reasoning is 106. So there is a skewed profile there in terms of Cat. She would be an extreme spatial learner, but that profile does not support all aspects of mathematics. Yeah. So there's definitely a need to investigate further there. And then Nathan, who we've pulled out, again, he is very similar to Ben. His progress test in math score was 80. The quantitative reasoning is 91. So we've got an average score and a below average score there, and that means that he's much lower than expected. But then if we look back at his non-verbal and his spatial, these were 83 and 81. So again, this spatial ability score of 81 may well be impacting on his maths attainment. So again, this is just showing how the report is looking at quantitative and maths, or verbal and English, but it is important, particularly with maths, to look at those other scores because they could be having an impact.
Yes, absolutely. And I think
yes, we pulled this student out because on the surface, the score, which here is for the new group reading test, at 101 is average. And if you didn't know that she had a Cat verbal score of 122, you might be quite happy with that score and think, well, she's attaining well, she's not going to have a problem accessing the curriculum.
That's absolutely vital.
We don't need to do anything else. But actually, the fact that you know her potential is much, much higher probably means that support is needed there.
And that kind of scoring ability, you would not have any other way of finding. There is no other way of doing that within the classroom.
You wouldn't know it. Yeah. So that's why it's really important. And I think she comes up later as well.
Yes, she comes back. Right.
Now this is Joshua, again, another slightly different case that we've pulled out. And he has got a score of 130 in his verbal reasoning. And this puts him in the top 2% of students of the same age. So again, it's similar to the last case. We've got a score of 104, which would not cause us concern. He's not an EAL student, but without knowing that he actually has this very, very high potential, we might not be alerted to the need to do something to support him in terms of his literacy. We've also got I haven't got his PTE score here, but I think if for a student where the NGRT and the progress test in English have been administered, for a student like this, I think it would be worth running the individual reports. And in fact, the individual report for NGRT is free of charge, so it would be well worth looking at any particular pattern. We've highlighted here that maybe reading fluency is an issue. Fluency is a combination of rate of reading and accuracy of reading. Now that's not necessarily going to be an issue with the verbal section of Cat 4. This is word level reading. The minute you get into NGRT and you get beyond the sentence section, the children will be reading extended text. And clearly they need to read the whole of the text and the questions to be able to get through a good amount of that test.
As you say, the individual reports for PT
will show that. Will show that. Absolutely. Yeah, they will show that very clearly. And here's our EAL student again. So we can see here that we do have a score here for the progress test in English, and this is really very low. And again, it would be worth looking at an individual report, although my guess would be is that she's very low across the board. But half of progress test in English is testing the technical skills, so spelling, comprehension, spelling, grammar and punctuation. So it could be that she needs particular support in those areas, because with a verbal score of 122, we would expect her progress test in English to be much higher.
Okay, all of those examples we've been looking at are where attainment is actually lower than might be expected. And I said also with these reports, we've looked where perhaps it may be appearing to exceed that CAT score that is giving the expectation, as it were. Similarly, just as in the last reports, we have the grouping of students shown on here, and we have a narrative section that suggests areas that are very important and will impact on that difference between the two scores. Again, I've blown them up somewhat larger, and once again, language, but this time acting in the other way, in that if you have stronger language skills, then you are going to be able to unpack the literacy parts of maths questions. So much so that it may be that it may appear that an individual student compared to one with weaker language skills is better at maths. It may be that they are also better at the literacy element, and the actual maths is more equivalent and hidden behind that. But language is still extremely important. In this one, this is the other half enlarged. I want to just highlight a couple of points on here. Firstly, it may very well be that why do people do well and outstrip an average level of ability is because it's of great interest in them. They're hardworking, they have a high degree of motivation, whether that's personal interest, parental interest, that they have a high degree of support within school. And certainly this is again where PAS can come to the fore in looking at areas that are very, very hard to get information on within a normal classroom situation. And within PAS, it's all self-reported, so we can be assured that the information we're getting is not our perception of a child, but it's actually how they feel about themselves. I don't think it's actually highlighted it on this occasion, but just above the yellow area there, it also talks about another factor that can lead to outperformance is where they may have extra support. They might have extra lessons, they might have parental input, they might have private tutoring, or they might just have very good teaching. Often the fact that it's so overlooked in the whole process that why are we there as teachers? You know, we are there to facilitate their learning, to bring out the best. So I think, you know, it's sad that one of the last things we ever think about is that they might actually have good teachers. Anyway, an example coming up. I don't know if you want to talk about this one. I think this comes back to the same point about a high degree of motivation, but also with a bit of a warning.
Yes, this is Ben again, who we talked about. I think we were talking about his maths originally, yes, weren't we? Right. So this again, just to reiterate here we have a student with an average verbal reasoning score of 101 and attaining in progress test in English a score of 119. So again, it's looking at these issues. He's doing much better than would be expected in terms of his CAT scores. Of course, we must always interrogate the CAT scores because that reflects performance on a single day. So again, it would be good to think about whether that is a good reflection of his verbal ability. But again, as with any kind of assessment. So again, this is an example, as Phil was explaining, where performance in attainment tests can actually be significantly better than those than performance in ability tests.
The warning bit I think I was probably alluding to was that where verbal skills are very good, it may mask the fact that perhaps a lower ability score and where subjects become increasingly cognitively demanding.
I think that's very true, and I think that's
why... You might not be
why...
aware of a problem at the very last moment.
Definitely, because we find that CAT scores are fairly stable. So a score of 101, if the child is assessed in Year 7, is highly likely to be a score of 101 in Year 9. So we're looking at that as being quite stable. And as the cognitive load in terms of curriculum subjects increases, it may be that gap diminishes. So I think that's fine if you've got a score of 101, but if you've got a gap where the score is lower, then that should be something that is flagged, for example, when you're looking at options in Year 9, something like that. Yeah.
I think we're down to our last example now, which is Daniel, as I remember.
So in this case, we actually have a further score for Daniel. He appears to be attaining a much higher level in terms of reading than his CAT verbal would indicate. But he actually has a progress test in English score of 93, and that means that in terms of English, rather than just reading, his attainment is much lower than his ability suggests. So again, this would be a case where I think it would be worth running that individual report for progress test in English and looking at that English skills section to see if it's a technical side of English that is depressing that score, because based on NGRT, the comprehension should be absolutely fine. But as we said, progress test in English is in 2 parts, and the first part looks at spelling, grammar, punctuation.
And let's not forget that model is all about teacher judgment as well.
Yes, exactly.
Let's actually talk to the teachers.
Yeah.
Let's look at their books. Let's ask the child.
Definitely. Most definitely.
Can we sum up?
Yes, so we started by saying that we felt that GL assessment had something very positive to offer to support the aims and aspirations of the Donaldson review. And I hope we've just touched on that here, and we felt that looking at the combination report would be helpful because we know that CAT4 is used very widely. The progress test series are new tests, they're new this year, but we've produced this combination report that can be used with 1 or 2 of those tests. The progress test in English or the MGRT can be used, but if you've done both, you can run a separate report. The report is free of charge. So just to go through some of the areas that we identified early on. So the focus on developing skills and attributes, we definitely can cover that, and we can combine ability, attitudes and attainment. We can look at those through using our assessments. Learning to be viewed as a continuum, I think we've demonstrated that assessment that can underpin that learning continuum is also available as a continuum. So CAT would be used once or twice with a student, PASS would be used once or twice with a student?
Yes, if you were looking at interventions, then that would be the way forward. It could be used a longer term to track and monitor.
So year on year?
Yes.
Okay. So the progress test series, we have tests for more or less every year group from age 5. So I think we're being quite helpful in that area. Again, the reports, we've just touched on the combination report, and we've just touched on the bit of narrative that's in there, and we've done that in a particular way. Our other reports have much more direct calls to action, I would say, than the combination report.
I particularly like the fact that in this area we've highlighted areas, you know, it's back to really involving the teacher and the individual.
They're prompts really for things to think about. Yeah, absolutely. A range of assessment approaches. We have the survey in PASS. We have CAT4, which is, as we've described, a sort of anchor test. And we know that lots of schools are using that. They revisit those results time and again to make judgments about for their children. And then there's the year-on-year approach with the progress test series.
I'd also say it complements the Oliphant's assessment.
Definitely, absolutely.
Assessment, right down to the, what did I just say, what were the three most
Yes.
important things in the lesson?
Yes,
all
exactly.
of that is assessment. What we're doing is we're adding in things that are difficult for the teacher to do within the individual school.
That's right.
Not replace it.
And they're doing it very occasionally. So you've got your hourly, daily, weekly, termly assessment, and then within that you can, once a year, twice a year, you can use something from our portfolio. And finally, the emphasis on formative assessment, and as we've shown, PASS and CAT may be used formatively, but also the progress test series can be used formatively, and I think the most important test there is probably the transition test. So for anybody dealing with children coming into year 7, that's a really brilliant test to use alongside CAT 4 particularly.
Yes, from secondary baseline.
Exactly. So that's all we wanted to say today. We have got a couple of questions here. Yes, the cost of the combination report, just to reiterate, if you're using CAT, the combination report will be allocated to your account, whether you're a paper user or a digital user. And if you then add in one of the other three, either the math, the English, or new group reading test, you can then run that report, and it's completely free of charge. We are looking to include the science by the middle of next year, so we are actively working on including the science there. Yeah, I've got one here about somebody using CAT for young learners, asking whether that can be included in the combination report. At the moment, it can't be included, so we're looking at CAT level A and above, with the equivalent tests from the progress test series. CAT for young learners, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is half of CAT. So instead of having 2 subtests for each battery, there's just the one. And because everything we do in this report is based on real data and quite large data sets, we need to collect that data before we can actually do the analysis and include young learners in the combination report. But again, that's something we are working on.
Okay, well, I've got one that's come through as well, and that is asking about the secondary levels of the progress test maths.
Oh, yes, yes.
That we've got the primary level currently. I understand that it won't be long now before the...
No, middle of February, the progress test in maths 12, 13 and 14 in paper and digital will be available.
Okay.
And I think that's everything. That wraps it up. No other questions? No. Lovely. Thank you so much, and thank you for your time this afternoon.
Yes, thanks very much.